we static electroshock details. Yeah, okay, great. So yeah, actually, these are all the things I just listed. So there you go,
So
perfectly.
can you all see really well or not really? Can you please move it a little bit tilted so that?
Sure, I just want us to too. So if you're in the back, feel free to come closer. The online people seeing me as well, or us as well. Feel free to come on closer. There's chairs here, you know, yeah, if you need to see better. Yeah. I mean, I know you guys are leaving a bit early too. Great. So yeah, with that, what is post-digital literacy? That is the kind of thing we are here to tackle. This mysterious and nebulous word, the post-digital. It's confusing to people who presumably work in this field, like us. Yes, it's an interesting idea that is basically in nuts and bolts. Really quickly, I can just say it's problematizing really strong analog digital distinctions that we have in education, across all kinds of fields, and especially in terms of the kind of research that we do. So here are some. A recent paper we wrote is The Challenge of Post-Digital Literacy. It came out in this journal, Post-Digital Science and Education, which is a very interesting journal, lots of interesting debate. Natasha's been a part of years. Yeah. Since the start. There's an OG. Yeah. Way about what literacy is, speaking about how the post-digital perspective in literacy acknowledges the extensive integration of digital technologies into essentially all areas of life. It also critically examines the ethical implications of this integration, such as surveillance, control, exploitation, misinformation, and disinformation that come to the fore with mass digitization. Let's just say that.
And maybe with situations, or how should I call them, such as the Internet of Things, right? When the internet is obviously not putting together only digitally virtual entities, but you operate your vacuum cleaner with the internet.
Yep, and the fact that we maybe have little digital chips inside of us and all these other things, and algorithmic capitalism, and you name it, anything. So studies, we're building on the logical approach, people like, and this a key author, Bat, and we're trying to emphasize that no matter what, you're engaging with the digital, you're engaging with the analog, it is always you're always responding to primarily embodied environmental affordances and constraints. No matter what, you're on your smartphone, you are tactile embodiment to navigate that. However, a lot of the theories of we can go through tons and tons of examples of how this actually manifests, but yeah, this is some orienting quotes here. Yeah, how do we move on? Yeah, there we go. Oh yeah, I just skipped ahead a million. Yeah, it was just a slow computer. There we go. Yeah, thank you. So if you close if you need to, I'll move it forward a tiny bit. But yes, maybe we should close this. Here, I got it. Okay, somebody's got that. Thank you. That's. So this is from that recent paper, Challenge of Post-Digital Literacy. You can, it's a bit of a straw man. We shouldn't have maybe called it traditional literacy approaches, but we take a lot of care to specify what those traditional approaches are. But we can see some kind of continual approaches. They focus on text. They focus on textual encoding and decoding. They don't focus on environmental modeling. They focus, environmental learning is considered discontinuous and distinct from digital media learning. That seems to be a core feature of these theories. We're saying environmental learning, embodied learning is considered continuous and integrated with digital media learning. There is a conceptual focus on distinct and bounded media forms. Part of our shared emphasis on multimodality is what we focused at we always think there are intermodal relations. There's always transmediation happening. Media forms are becoming other types of media all the time. So we are acknowledging that media is not bounded, it's always bleeding over into other media. That's part of our, yep, and then all kind of framing it all here is we focus on the sign. So we come from a world of educational semiotics. So sign is an important concept. We focus on the sign as a dynamic multimodal event that students respond to, rather than doing, we see an image of the sign or sign as textual, abstract presentation, not an event, not something experienced, not something. Just a little background. Now to get to the main, yeah, doesn't work for me there? Oh, there we go. I'm going back now?
No.
Oh, there we go, there we go.
And from now on, I think it should work, yeah.
Thank you, Aline, appreciate that. This is Aline and myself, this is our inspiration. We were sitting on Burnaby Mountain Park there. We walked, I showed Aline the forest. We walked through the forest a little bit, got to that hillside where you were essentially looking over this vast array here, Schley-Watt, also known as Burrard Inlet or Indian Arm. But specifically, we were talking about what is really inconsistent, and somehow technology is sometimes when there's electricity. But we were trying to think, okay, there's a broader sense of technology that these definitions are obviously not encompassing, they're missing. And we noticed that we were looking at ecological ruin directly in front of us. And that is the famous fish weir, Stisma, Squamish Tsleil-Waututh fish weir, 1,300-year-old ruin. You can see it right here. We saw these pegs coming out of the ground, leading you into high tide. And it's a very college. If anyone knows the work, they draw the fish out into deeper water, actually want to swim to shallow water. So once they're, it's a wonderful piece of ocean management because they doors, pegs, and space for the fish. How bottom of the ocean. A natural kind of abundance, or you could just, we're
Explain that's misleading.
we will explain there's misleading aspects. Ruin, and it really, yeah, it's good.
And I think we're making some post-colonial point there, right? Because in how it's really easy to miss that we're looking at some technology or some technological ruin there. So European settlers and whatnot might miss all kinds of technologies embedded in all kinds of environments and ecological systems, right? Here where we find ourselves, right, by local indigenous populations. They would miss out the human-made artifacts and see in there instead something like pristine nature, which is entirely a misconcept, right? Mm-hmm. And that would feed into a portrayal of local indigenous as living in nature in the sense of being barbaric, undeveloped.
Connotations. It could even have positive connotations, but regardless, it's reductive. It's reductive, which is a really key point there. And I wanted to say this: how many times have people here who are from the Pacific Northwest? How many times have you been standing on a beach? Like for myself, I was on Cortez Island, Squirrel Cove. We were looking at this massive amount of shellfish production on this beach, and we were just like, where does it all come from? And then we saw a rock wall, and then another rock wall, and then another rock wall, and one of them stretched a kilometer across the shoreline in Cortez Island here, and we're like, oh, this is not natural abundance. This is years and generations of shaping the land management practices that create this abundance. I even years to recognize those rock walls as a kind of technology. I've had to literally decolonize myself, you might say, right?
Exactly, and that's the point in terms what you mentioned earlier, technology without nature, because it's not that there is no nature, but it's embedded, it's kind of merged, it's together with technology. So usually in the nature there is technology, and then also technology stems from the nature. So the kind of this distinction there is blurred in a way.
Yeah.
And I think that's just mainly about not making that as a binary.
Exactly.
It's about that.
Well, this is what we'll exactly, Natasha. This is what we'll be talking about. Thank you. The analog and the digital are necessarily blurred. They can't be totally dichotomized. So really great point. Thank you. So yeah, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to rethink the digital. What is digital? What is analog? What is technology? And maybe we can get to some. To you, Aline, in 2 seconds. In 2 seconds, I'll just say the first point here is, yes, exactly, our key point. We're trying to address narrow, inconsistent concepts of technology, digital analog distinctions in research. The idea that technology is detached or from nature, it disembodies inherently. It's when we turn electricity on. it does. So, do you want to carry over this mind-body dualism plate? Yeah.
Right. Well, of course. So I hope that we're already suggesting that what we're after here is a way of looking at technology that eschews mind-body dualisms in its many forms. And particularly in an educational concern, we think that a dualist philosophy has been lingering in, for instance, notions of literacy, and the fact that public education in the modern age became possible and indeed affected through the spread of printing technology led to a confusion between, I know I'm drawing a very abrupt historical shortcut here, but it led to a confusion between critical thinking or reason in general and print literacy, right? Literacy of manipulating alphanumeric symbols on paper, right? And we see also this as resulting into the disciplinary isolation of particularly here educational technology, right? And we want to make the point that, well, all education is technological, right?
Yeah,
and education is inherently technological, exactly.
And then
Thank you. So recently, as you know, in the humanity, we've got ongoing transformations as, for instance, humanity is broadly becoming a type of science and technology studies. A recent hypothesis that we find very fruitful in avoiding mind-body dualisms is what's called the mind-technology problem, or the mind-technology continuity perspective. And from this perspective, Steve Fuller, whom you might have come across because he's one of the most famous transhumanists at the moment. Social epistemology more than.
Well, that I like, but go on. Yeah.
He likely has, yeah.
He has a lot of books.
He has a lot of books. So he recently defined this is a paper in exactly in that Postdigital Science and Education journal, where he defines technology as minds outworking in nature, and we really like that. But we want to scrap out nature. So in inspiration, but also with some criticism to Fuller, we define technology as the mind's outworking. Full stop.
Sure. Okay, we're just in the middle of a big workshop here, but we are, some of us are. Okay, that's great, that's great. Great, great. Sorry, go on, Aline, yes.
So technology is the mind's outworking. There is no nature. The concept of nature is misleading and it's ideologically charged, right? Nature was invented as a concept in Romanticism, in European Romanticism, carrying all the, ideological baggage of Romanticism and of the Enlightenment, which, we don't want to be staunch critics of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was also great, but it was also awfully Eurocentric, very,
Encouraging
justifying,
monomodality,
encouraging it established monomodality
colonization,
and
et cetera,
colonization and
yeah,
so on.
yeah.
So we want to construe technology without nature, not follow that dualism.
Yeah.
And so this view is embedded in the mind technology continuity perspective, right? What's the point here? In a nutshell, this answers to this, put it in very simple but broad terms, these questions about inner and outer, right? But instead of thinking of mind and matter or mind and body and stuff like that as a dichotomy, the answer here is in looking at mind technology as a continuity, right? Where you can't separate the two, right? So of course,
where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin, right? It's a good question.
Which is how extended mind theory started. Like Clark and Chalmers, when they coined extended mind theory, they started their paper exactly like this, with the question, where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? Pointing out to the problems that stem from dualist worldviews, right? So what they have advocated for is an externalism based on the active role of the environment in driving cognitive processes. And more recently, particularly taking the extended mind theory into the mind technology hypothesis, Thainer, which is quite a prominent scholar on embodiment and technology, explains that by considering us as cyborgs, so should we stop for a second?
No, it's okay. I think it's totally fine. Yeah.
So he mentions that by considering us as cyborgs, the extended mind theory blurs the customary boundary between biology and technology, right? Or between user and tool. And there's some very important points here, right? In blurring biology and technology, we see our way into mind technology continuity and technology without nature.
Yes.
And there's a very important point in not distinguishing between user and tool, right?
Yeah.
And from this perspective, we distinguish between two types of tools. There are technological artifacts. There are technological artifacts that do not have semiotic agency, right? Such as a rock or a hammer. Of course, a hammer is a hammer when I recognize it as a hammer. So there's already agency in the hammer. And then there are tools with semiotic agency, such as interpreters. For instance, Scary over here is an excellent example of a tool with semiotic agency.
Oh, a tool.
Yeah. Quite instrumental, Gary. Thank you, Gary, for your service. So what do tools with semiotic agencies do, such as Scary? Well, they bring on into their computation other tools. Might they have or not semiotic agency, right?
So that what we saw in those definitions from ed tech, from these other fields, that there is a strong dichotomization between user of the tool and the tool itself.
Yes.
And we are saying tool only becomes a tool once it is reintegrated with the user, with the analog experience, right? Of course, it can go down to earth and does something for us when it can become integrated with.
So we resist those views of technology. So
just to add that, a very good example there is when we use our phones. So our phones are actually collecting data about us, and then we are becoming tools for our phones.
Absolutely.
Effectively, because they will be then affecting also our behaviors, or at least trying to affect our behaviors through algorithms, but also in that relationship between us and technology, where there are we were different kinds of tools in that context. So we're also then the tools for our technology and kind of that relationship.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And you're right. And when we were looking at Stitsma, we're looking at the fish weir. You can't easily see the users, you can't see the creator of the tool. Who created the fish weir? Well, it wasn't created by one person. It was created over the course of many generations. Who's using it? That itself is not always easy to see as well. So this prevents us from seeing certain things as technology when they are technology, to build back on that point. Thank you, Susanna, for crowd controlling there. Yeah, it's important. It's really important.
And I'm diving deeper here in the philosophy underpinning the theory that we're trying to develop. So, one thing that Carrie and Natasha and I have in common is semiotics. The way in which we see semiotics asking the right questions and bringing important answers is something that brought us together to work. And so as we've already seen for the notion of semiotic agency, we're looking at the extended mind and the mind technology continuity from a semiotic perspective. And this is to say that symbols grow. And I'll get there in a moment. But first, Tyner also noticed that historically, it's hard to exaggerate the profound impact, he says, of the human drive towards incorporation. Right? It's Clark and Chalmers' extended mind theory strictly were not the first to talk about the extended mind. Right? A classic example is McLuhan. Right? Media are extensions of the human body, and Tyner even goes all the way back to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Right? The beginnings of pragmatism over here. So this is mid 19th century. Emerson saying that the human body is the magazine of inventions, the patent office, where are the models from which every hint was taken. All the tools and engines on earth are only extensions of its limbs and senses. And then he goes on that one definition of human is an intelligence served by organs. So far, so good. I think all this is great. And yeah, I think he goes a bit shy in our perspective, because he says that machines can only second, not supply his unaided senses. But we see here two important notions: mind as extension, and the distinction between. I guess here he sees as the distinction between user and tool, which we put under the same label. They're all the same thing, just that some have semiotic agency and some not. There is, at the end of the day.
And I'll just say here that there is perspective.
Yeah, and Steve Fuller, who was mentioned before, also places Peirce in this history as well. And please, yes, let's continue. Peirce was instrumental, according to Fuller, and we agree, right, in the continuous turn of mind, in seeing evolution as an evolution of degree, not kind. And that plays out in concepts of emergence and so on. So Peirce, now we're looking at Peirce then, which is the pillar of our philosophy. Well, Peirce particularly says straightforwardly that symbols grow. Symbols are a type of signs, right? Into the nitty-gritty of which I will not go. But symbols grow, he says. And to explain what he means by the fact that symbols grow, he interestingly cites Emerson. So he is really looking at extensions, whom he also knew personally. So he goes on to say that symbols grow. They come into being by development out of other signs, particularly from icons. That is, from semiotically more simple units. We think only in signs. A symbol once in being spreads among the peoples. In use and in experience, its meaning grows. The symbol may, with Emerson's Sphinx, say to human, of thine eye I am I been. And this is from the riddle of the Sphinx. Now, the interesting thing here is that so the symbol is a type of sign, a particular type of sign that is quite complex, and par excellence it grows, as Peirce explains. Now, more interestingly, Peirce doesn't make the distinction, the ontological distinction between user and tool, because if symbols which we use, grows, as he explains over here in experience and so on, well, we the users are also signs, we're also semiotic stuff in our own turn, right? So he explains that the word or sign and words are obviously symbols.
Then we can think of, he's thinking of symbols as a kind of technology. Symbols as a kind of technological
Exactly.
artifact that does stuff in the world. The mind out working, not in nature, but out working, as we said. And I just love this passage. Interrupt you.
Go ahead.
And we've always talked about this passage, Aline.
Yeah.
It's kind of one of our go-tos. But yeah, I just love it. Just to read brain. And then what I find I cannot. You see, your faculty of language was localized in that lobe.
That's
no doubt. If he had flinched my my inkstand, I should not have been able to continue my discussion until I had got another. So my faculty of discussion is equally localized in my inkstand. Or on the theory that the distinction between physical and psychic, I can't speak. Physical and psychical phenomena is the distinction between final and efficient causation. It is plain enough that the inkstand and the brain lobe have the same to the functions of the mind.
And there's a lot to unpack here, which we shall not maybe in the discussion.
But it's a great quote.
And now to point out where does all of this take us. I'm looking here at current contemporary semiotic perspectives, right? And I'll particularly mention just two things. One, that from a media semiotic perspective, particularly inspiration of course, but not only, this major contemporary scholar Marcel Danesi remarks that the technology that undergirds, as he calls it, echoing McLuhan, the digital galaxy, will produce a re-embodiment as a result of what McLuhan calls retribalization, right? Despite the digital electronic technology adding layers of representation and layers of technological artifacts in human societies, it reintegrates the body and the mind, right? Obviously, unlike print, for instance, that gave us an illusion of being distanced from from other ecological systems.
And through the integration of body, McLuhan is really anticipating, the social media type innovations, the idea that you can be watching some live event and responding all at once. There's nothing like print literacy, as you know. He's anticipating something occurred, and it's worth noting that Danesi is from the University of Toronto.
Yeah,
a student.
He comes from McLuhanian.
Yeah, he comes from. Yeah.
And as a final point on this particular matter, we point out to Magnani, who also in inspiration of Percy's semiotics very directly, developed what's called an eco-cognitive computationalism theory, which is particularly important for us because aiming here to develop a philosophy of technology, we need the concept of computation as well, right? And the aim of Magnani's theory is to explain, as he says, emergence, that is the emergence of new forms of computations, which new forms of computation have the role to transform ignorant entities in cognitive entities through computation. So what Magnani is saying here is that when Kerry uses ChatGPT to figure out a more complex idea, Kerry is transforming the ignorant entity of ChatGPT into cognitive entities by bringing it into his computation.
So it has to be integrated again. So this is a definition of computation that we are going to build on here, and we're going to kind of adapt for our own purposes.
Exactly. And I guess that's it. Like with this other quote, I wanted to point out that the core of Magnani's theory, cognitive computational theory, is Percy's semiotic notion of inference, which is also our core philosophical point. And now we should move on to explain how.
Yes. So now maybe we can actually get to maybe drawing our thing on the board. And here is the thing: do we enlist Michael to draw, or do we try draw, or Natasha, or anyone? We try drawing we have a thing to draw, a model. It's simply a knot, kind of ropey knot. That is a model of what we're talking about. And we're going to use it to kind of talk about these different. Oh, sorry. Yeah, these are the ones you want. These are. Yeah. So we need to do something like this.
You want the spirals.
Yeah, no, well, we need both. We need the spirals and we
And the
need the
fiber.
knots.
The
Yeah,
knot,
but you-
let's go for the knots.
Go for the
Go for both. You start with one, start with the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can do the knot, I can do the spiral.
Yeah, one of you can do each. There's two of you. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, guys. Yeah, appreciate that. That's wonderful. Yeah.
We really hope that the online audience can see this.
Yeah, I actually think they can. If I set it up pretty well.
I mean, if you want to use the thicker markers, they're also newer.
Yeah, Aline, use the ones in Natasha's hand because they are gonna work much better.
Thanks.
Yeah. And just make sure you give each other enough space on the board. Yeah.
So
Fine.
you can go on here.
Yeah, I'll go on. Yeah, certainly. So we have this sense that this is the essence of our theory. We're gonna, like we said, we have a different sense of the analog, a different sense of the digital than you probably have. The digital is not just zeros and ones. It's something else for us, okay? It's something much broader. You might think of smoke signals and as an early form of digitization. White smoke, dark smoke. You can have a whole complicated Boolean logic with that. Telegraphs, mass digitization. But we want to look at, I'm a music person, music teacher, educator, and one thing we look at in our music classes a lot of is loops of humanity and the fact that how humans have been making 60,000 years, 100,000 years. Material. And the remarkable thing is that these bone loops have so many, they can be in Slovenia, they can be in Germany, they can be in China, but they anywhere, and they have remarkable similarities. One of the consistent similarities is the fact that they're all pentatonic in some ways. They have pentatonic scales, modalities projected onto them. So all of them are made out of the bones of birds' wings, because birds' wings are hollow and pretty good materials for flutes. But they have this simple 5-note scale or structure between an octave, which is remarkable. And a lot of people have talked about how the pentatonic scale, unlike say the European major scale, the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, the 7-note scale, society somehow or another has these pentatonic scales, which is really just mind-boggling to ethnomusicologists. But what it reflects is that it's something in our embodied musicality as humans. From earlier hominid of pitch. Onto pure integer ratios, onto these bone flutes, stemming from our embodied perception. I like to on this kind of, oh, you guys did a good job. That was pretty quick. I wasn't paying attention. You guys, yeah, good. Thanks, Natasha.
I don't seem that capable.
So exactly. So our point is that sense perception itself, every kind of sensory perception stems from a kind of entangled analog knot. Our ears are connected to our eyes, are connected to our smell. We can disconnect them, but we have this kind of analog gestalts that are at the root of our perception. We experience things as a totality, and we use this term analog gestalt. You start here. But somehow over what happens, what can happen is a process of what we have labeled, and we have a glossary at the end of this actually that defines our terms, digital fractionization. Somehow this analog gestalt is broken down into various part for whole relationships that can then be reassembled. Essentially, I like to think of that pentatonic scale being projected onto that vulture's bone as something similar to that. An analog gestalt, a perception of musicality that stems from our embodiment, our environments and our embodiment, is being broken down. We are finding pitch relationships. We're saying an octave can be divided in this way. We can have these 5-note structuring. This is an early process, we would say, of digitization. Again, expanding this term quite a lot beyond what you normally think, might normally think. But what happens, our whole point, and the whole thing that Aline was driving home here, tool use separation, is that it is only technology once this occurs, once it becomes analog, reintegrated again, analog integration, we call it. So digital fractionization, analog integration. It only becomes technology that we can use, and it's only really technology once this integration occurs, right? So we are constantly digitizing things on different scales, and you can see movements of progressions of technological artifacts, drums to flutes, to stringed instruments, to eventually a very, very complex kind of digitization, the invention of the piano, clavichord, harpsichord, the keyboard, the pianoforte keyboard, which you see on the screen there. That is very complex. We're moving away from modal sensibilities, and we're trying to come up with a compromise where we can say, can we play in all 12 keys? Well, we can if we divide the octave just so, and we temper the third just so, and we make all these negotiations. But by doing so, we have a huge array of possible musical possibilities that open up, possibilities beyond the modal bone flute. However, again, it only becomes something technological once it becomes integrated. And what happens when that keyboard, that piano keyboard, the harpsichord keyboard becomes analogically reintegrated with your embodied musicality and culture? Well, you have Baroque music. You have something that can respond to the fact that we have a piano and we can play in all 12 keys. And we have to invent a whole new musical system, a whole new way of thinking about music for that integration to occur. So just to build on that, if you see keyboards, this is what kind of another starting point for us, Natasha and Eileen, that we had this idea from Steve Jobs, that Steve Jobs said, somehow he said when the iPhone came out that, sorry to steal your thunder, Eileen, but when the smartphone came out, that he said that the keyboard was a mistake. We have these keyboards, but in his mind, it was a mistake because it's not integrated analogically with our embodiment. There's something much more intuitive about the swipe and the gesture that you use on a smartphone. Like Eileen said, I don't type on you, but I may touch you, I may gesture towards you, right? But our point is more, well, the keyboard, the bottom keyboard, not the piano keyboard, was a step on the way. It's part of the scaffolding that leads to the gradual creation of the touchscreen, you might say, right? But it's part of a much broader continuum. You have to have speech. You have to have a descendant larynx that can allow you to talk as humans can talk. Then we have to be able to have distinguished phonemes and all these sounds. And then that distinguishing of phonemes, 25 phonemes in a language, that is a technological artifact according to us. And that allows you to do things in the world. Yeah.
And we're thinking of phonetic articulation as digitization.
Phonetic articulation, exactly, as digitization, eventually leading to the creation of alphabet, leading to the creation of keyboards, touchscreens. Greece?
And if I may add to discuss what we mean with these drawings.
Yeah.
We thought of these two types of diagrams to represent pictorially what we're talking about here. And what we have in mind is that, this is an analog complexity. Well, it is an environment, as it's often called in semiotics because of some history of ideas, an Umwelt in German. And we'll call this Umwelt one. And well, when we digitize something, so I say make the keyboard, then we do something with that keyboard. We use it to articulate concepts by, that's the point of writing, right? Whatever it's so, or perhaps an even simpler example, we make the pianoforte to then make more complex Baroque music. So once we have, say, Baroque music, which is we call it analog integration of something that was digitized. Well, we're living in a new environment in Umwelt 2. Of course, Umwelt 2 is not entirely distinct from Umwelt 1. They are similar, right? But it is more complex. And of course, what's the point in actually making our worlds more complex? Well, because we're saying as we model more complex environments, we acquire greater semiotic freedom, would be the point. And the same goes here, like this is one environment and this is another environment of greater complexity.
An extended
environment, exactly.
Yeah.
No,
thank you. So the diagrams represent the same thing a little differently, but thank you, Eileen. That makes great sense. And Natasha, you had this lovely point that
yes, I think I'll just develop that when we come to that slide.
Okay.
I think it's better that way.
Good. Okay. So I think that is pretty much. Oh yes, this is another example I want. Oh,
I don't know
yeah.
if you want to comment on the particular keyboard that you showed on the previous slide that was the insight coming from Michael.
I want Mike. Which you actually can speak to now, actually. Yeah, that's actually a good time, but while we're on.
Do you want to show that keyboard?
Let's go back, That's Dvorak. There it is.
Yeah.
This is the Dvorak keyboard, actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
some of you may know this, that the keyboards that we have on our computers are basically simulate from the old typewriters. And they were known as the QWERTY keyboard, right? The QWERTY, first set of letters on the upper left. And the story goes that when typewriters were first coming into office use in the late 1800s, early 1900s, typists, predominantly, in fact, almost solely female, their facility was so good at adapting to this new technology that the technology couldn't adapt to their proficiency, that the arms with the keys on them were constantly getting jammed. And so the QWERTY keyboard was established to actually slow down the typists. So it was from the point of view of what you're talking about with respect to the ability for an organism to be able to cognize a more complex environment and therefore have greater semiotic freedom. This is being actually truncated significantly for women at that time to restrict their ability. So rather than adapt the technology to facilitate their greater capacity, it was just installed in such a way, new technology was installed to actually close the complexity, the potential for complexity and capacity that you're talking about there. So what got interesting again is how this is the same keyboard now, despite what Steve Jobs said, that the keyboard is a mistake. So it was kind of interesting.
It is interesting, and we still have it, yeah.
Remain the same, although as you pointed out, the idea of swiping and being able to use touch screen applications is far more fitting with what you're saying in terms of this integration of mind working into environment, right, to nature.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And just all to say, everything Michael's saying here is that this space of digital fractionalization is a political, social space.
Yeah.
People control how they didn't like how fast these women typists were analogically integrating the digitization, right?
Yeah.
They need to go back here and control this space as a political space and slow this down, slow this integration down.
Can I add just another quick piece? As those of you who are musicians would know this, the standard piano keyboard includes the fact that there are a whole bunch of tones in between.
This is a really great.
Exactly,
And
absolutely.
that's really significant when you look cross-culturally at what other music traditions have evolved and have
Especially our Pacific Northwest.
especially here, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
which have a rich tonality.
Yeah.
So when you create, as Michael's saying, you create that 12, there's only 12 pitches between the octave, you lose microtonality, you lose affordances.
Yeah.
But you also open up new affordances.
Yeah.
You have an extended.
Yeah.
Other extended possibilities.
There's interesting conversations we could get into with respect to colonization and what counts as music, et
Yes.
cetera, et cetera. But that's a conversation for another time. But I think it speaks to this, your diagrams in terms of this, this educative function of does a platform enable greater participation or does it hinder it or limit it?
Thanks, Mike.
But I would like to remark on that note as well, if I may, that like pretty much any discussions on emergence, we take a position on path dependency, right? Because digitization, these digitizations show path dependencies, right? Well, okay, all Homo sapiens have phonemes, but then different groups decided to, choose to develop alphabets or other types of writing, right? We've got
Hieroglyphics.
hieroglyphics and so on, of course, which alphabets are developed.
Yeah, I know. It's earlier. Yeah.
We got the Chinese icon system and other types of writing that are not alphabet, and from then on you would scaffold something like keyboards differently and so on.
Yes. So that earlier stage or moving forward. I want to make this point, I make this all the time. Birds, these that we have all across North America, the white-chested sparrows. But they're really cute, and you've heard them before. They are known, ornithologists recognize their sound as the Canada, Canada. You may have heard that call. That's what it's called. It means bird, and they can be variable, but the ending is Canada, Canada, which is a triple. 20 years, 15 years, Northern BC, some of these male birds were singing a new song. Their iconic ending had changed for a period of time. It went from, oh, sweet Canada, 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 to Canada. They start stuttering the ending, doing a little too viral. It was infectious. It spread across Prince George, and within approximately 12 years, it was in Quebec. Wow, which is insane. Call, so iconic, we've recognized it for generations, changed in 12 and a half years. Animal culture. Susanna, yeah.
When was operated the next one?
Well, bird song, the development of bird song form. Whales have songs. And we have song forms. They start similar ways. They have additional bird is going to sing the song spread across the country.
If I may add to this, this example and everything that Kerry explained for us is it supports the mind technology continuity hypothesis.
Yes, exactly.
And we're seeing as songs, bird songs, as technological artifacts, and it's an example that feeds into our hypothesis that music capacities in hominins are modeling systems that have scaffolded language, and
exactly
language is not as a modeling system. Doesn't ex nihilo, so to say.
It's not completely unique out of nowhere.
It's not the emergence of languages in hominins. It does not mark difference of kind, but a difference of degree.
Exactly.
Coming from musicking.
And a book
across species.
And a book that really makes this clear, recent-ish book, is by the Yale evolutionary musicologist Gary Tomlinson. It's called A Million Years of Music. And it is literally that. He tracks evolutionarily and archaeologically a million years of music. Starting a million. And it makes that exact point that in language and time.
So basically the bottom line is that it's a new understanding of what technologies. That's at the kind of the underlying idea or philosophy, kind of should we or are we actually rethinking what technologies, so that it's at the intersection in between like the physical world and the mental world, basically. I mean, I would say that that's what's underlying everything.
Yeah, well, Natasha, do you want to build off on your section?
We want to.
So now, of course, we are thinking, and I'll try to be very quick because I really want to discuss with the colleagues and also to understand, you know, how everyone in the room actually, how you understand technology and also educational practice and what it means to you, not just like now this relatively new understanding, because there is no kind of entirely new understanding, right? Everything builds on something else. So here I'm tackling the idea of what that means for education and how we observe things such as educational concepts in our teaching practice. And what I mean by educational concept is actually a concept is this kind of mind physical thing. So it's not just the mental object or mental thing. It's at the intersection of mind and body, mind and the environment. So that's what it is supposed to be. And how then concepts develop, I think this is something that we need to engage our students with, regardless of the discipline of the program. I mean, discipline, interdisciplinary perspectives, because concepts develop based on available environmental affordances that actually allows us to understand and then explore the concept. And what happens is that they're always happening somewhere in between, on this continuum, in between this very, very constrained, bounded idea of a concept. I mean, you think of any concept. I mean, I did some research where we looked at the concepts in educational psychology, for example. So you can just, throw different concept like constructivism, yes, whatever. So it always exists in between this very constrained understanding of a concept. For example, think about the text definition, the dictionary definition. That's a very constrained description of a concept, and that's usually where we start from when we teach, or a lot of people choose to start from there. I mean, we don't have to start from there, but that's where we usually start from. And then what happens is that basically there are so many possibilities in terms of how that concept can be developed and can be expanded, and how it can be realized in the future and in the world. And it's always environmental, and it's always, and it goes in between these two imaginary ends. So imagine a very, very constrained definition, and then an abundance of possibilities and of concept realizations, depending on the context, depending on where it happens, depending on who interprets, who interacts, depending on the environmental setting. So it's always multi-contextual and multi-pathways, and it kind of resembles this idea of pluriverse, because it can go in any different direction. So that was my thinking, and that aligns, I think, really well with a lot of the ideas that Carrie and Lynn were talking about, and it also aligns with this evolutionary approach to learning that was developed and promoted by Peirce in terms of cynicism, that everything grows. I mean, you were talking about signs grow and symbols grow. So I think that's the crux of the matter, that we need to support our students to understand that we always go in between these two ends, a very, very constrained kind of environmentally, or whatever you prefer to call it, but it is environmental, because if we offer a text definition, a dictionary definition, a definition from the article that our students are reading, that is some sort of constraint. And then we need to recognize that. My position is not like I'm against it. No, I'm just recognizing it. I'm just recognizing that we are going in between these two ends, and they are kind of imaginary. I cannot really pin them down, like what is at each end. But let's imagine that they're here. This is where actually creativity, where actually growth of knowledge is situated. I mean, on that, if you think about this continuum. So basically what happens with concepts and with conceptual understanding is always somewhere there, like in between on this continuum, in between this very constrained, environmentally constrained approach to concepts and concept understanding, and this very kind of open-ended. So I call that kind of an approach of concept open-endedness, or kind of rhizomatic concept, because it can go in all sorts of different directions, and depending on, as I mentioned, all sorts of different contextual, interpretational, physical, material affordances. And that's why actually the concept of affordance is so important in our work. So if we move on,
sorry, can I actually just say one thing about your wonderful little diet?
Okay.
There, just really quickly.
Should I go back?
No, yeah, maybe I can go back.
Okay.
I'm not good at going back though. You can, yeah.
There.
Very easy, very easy. Okay. What made this crystallize for me, and I think Natasha explained it really well, symbols grow. Yes, they grow. So they don't just stay the same. The concept grows. what made this crystallize for me is Andy Staples' example. Andy Staples was, yeah, we have to mention, he's kind of through all of our works, and Andy was a
Aline's mentor.
doctoral supervisor, and he was actually my external examiner for my PhD thesis.
And he reviewed one of Natasha's books.
And he knows Natasha too.
It was very kind. It
Yeah,
was very kind.
he's a kind man. He was a kind man. And one of his examples was the nuclear inner city school in the UK somewhere, I don't know where, and sociologists were going to teach these kids what are sociological concepts. Okay, what's one concept? Nuclear family. Okay, kids, what do you think the nuclear family is? The kids start brainstorming. Okay, so nuclear means explosion. Interestingly, their constraints, their positionality, most of these kids in the classroom, their parents were separated or divorced in some way, or their families were not the conventional nuclear family. They're dispersed in various ways. So the kids say nuclear means explosion. Our families are dispersed and exploded. So a nuclear family is like our families. They're just like the normal kind of family. We have nuclear families. The sociologists could then go, yes, that's not what a nuclear family is. Or they can take Natasha's kind of point here and say, oh, this has actually expanded my understanding of that original concept of what the nuclear concept even means. I have a new enriched understanding. It's not to say it's wrong. It's simply the continuum of possibilities that radiate from that concept.
Exactly, and then you enter a dialogue with the children and kind of, then the concept itself becomes a kind of enriched and negotiated concept where you can say to the children, well, some people, some researchers, some scientists, they believe that nuclear family is this, but what you just explained is just as valid, and let's now explore that rather than just, as you said, slapping. Slapping it.
Michael, sure, you guys see. Michael had
I was just going to ask all of you, is it fair to say, too simplistic to say that the kind of stereotypical, if not maybe somewhat apocryphal, but it may be accurate in some senses, approach to rote learning is stuck in the single focus text?
I think it could be. You could definitely observe it, in that way. Although some people would find some merit, and rote learning kind of repetition, etc. And we're not here to kind of challenge and attack that. We're just here to acknowledge these differences and what each kind of end of this imaginary spectrum could be actually encouraging when it comes to our understanding of concepts. And that was a really good point. Thank you.
It may explain how our theories will map this out, right? What we do here when we start digitizing is constraining. And constraining is, I think, very important for exactly this emergence that we're all explaining here, understanding the greater, more complex concept and so on. So constraints are very important, very useful. So Natasha is explaining why, because they lead to a more complex environment with more possibilities through what we call analog integration. But what teachers often are tempted to do, and I'm not pointing fingers here, I know that I'm guilty as charged here, right? Well, what we as teachers are tempted often to do is, because we want to draw the learner's attention, the student's attention to the digitization method. And we forget about that the whole rationale is what we call analog integration, right? And that's what happens when like the sociologists are thinking, stupid kids, they didn't get it, right? They are obstructing them from analogically integrating this into a more complexly built environment of their own. Another example that Andy and I, with another friend, commented on in a paper some years ago. This other friend of ours, Maria Kamburi, had some interviews with school teachers where you get stuff like teachers getting pissed that pupils, like primary level pupils, would not get the point that water is not white. They would say that water is white. And to explain to them that water is not white, is in color, and hence doesn't have color, they would put a glass of water next to a glass of milk and say, see, the milk is white, the water is not. But look at me, I'm politically called white and I'm not the color of milk, right? So they're just, what's going on over there? Teachers are blocking analog integration. The kids from doing this analog integration in their own way,
Yeah.
in a way
Concept
that
production.
allows for, greater interpretative roots that are not that wrong, right? Are simply scaffolded on existing notions.
Yes, and you can always acknowledge, the kind of this social conceptualization of things without actually obstructing children's imagination. I think that was your point. I mean, we're not saying, oh, let's just now do like a chaotic kind of,
Explode.
yeah, let's everything explode. No, it's more about the approach and how we enter the communication with, adults, students, children, etc. So just to finish this, because I'm aware of the time, this is something that was linked to that facial recognition. And yeah, now I have revealed it, but I'm sure you have seen this joke or shared actively social media.
I'm still a head.
No, okay. Right. So I've chosen this because I think it's a kind of funny example of the primacy of those very first embodied experiences. Because once you see the next slide, I don't think you'll be able to actually see then, the same thing in the same way. So now, if I go back, you will just see what you've just seen as a label. So now, when you see this without the label, you still see the kind of some sort of mad octopus or drunk octopus trying to fight you. So that was a joke on widely shared on the internet. But what I'm trying to say here is that there is a tendency to see, we can see, okay, not all the time, as we just showed, but we can see faces in inanimate objects. And one of the reasons why we see faces, or why we can understand if someone tells us that this is a face, and we immediately understand that it's a face, and then we can also understand that a circle and two dots and just like a smiley is a face, is because there is some sort of primary understanding of everything around us through that very first encounter with our parents' faces, because that's the very first kind of environmental visual encounter. When we are brought into the world, we see faces, and that's like the strongest possible I would say input or interaction integration from the very, very birth. And then that's why we're able to see faces in all these different pictures, because there is a propensity to easily see faces. But that's different. So relational thinking, I'm here also talking about relational thinking and creative thinking, because relational thinking is effectively creative thinking, because we try to connect two things that are not obviously connected. So in psychology and clinical psychology, and also it's been a bit pathologized, the word akathenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. And what I'm trying to say is that relational thinking is similar to it, but it is not that, because there is one more thing to that. If we try to encourage learners to seek connections between things that are seemingly unrelated, the next thing is actually really proving that or exercising the meaningfulness of that connection. And I think this is also misleading, and if I may say, a little bit kind of prejudice, because it's almost nearly categorizing these types of thinking, and especially here in pareidolia, experiencing like a perception of a face within an inanimate object is almost observed as a sort of kind of pathological reaction, or not really a disease, but it's a kind of interesting problematic notion where where these kinds of things that if we think about it, on the one hand, we can think that that's actually the essence of creative thinking, of creativity, finding connections in seemingly unrelated things. So what is a new thing when we put two things that have not been put together before together? 2, 3, 4 things, whatever. Yes, and how do we make a contribution to knowledge when we write or doctoral students? So you combine things in new ways, and I think that's why I'm using this as just an example of a concept, of a definition, that if you actually use it in different contexts and if you understand it differently, actually is very useful and is very, very close to what creativity is and creative thinking and relational thinking is. And finally, there is this diagram where I use this conceptual growth and in between these constraints and abundance of affordances, situated in the upcoming book that Aline and I wrote on relational and multimodal higher education, which is basically understanding knowledge and conceptual development as this kind of conceptual growth that is situated at the intersection, this integrated space in between social relations, digital media relations, and more than human or environmental relations. So that would be a summary. So I would say that what we need to do then as educators is to encourage relational thinking practices in educational spaces when a concept or a practice is basically thought of on that continuum between that rigid, closed-bounded version of the concept with highly constrained affordances and that more kind of open-ended concept idea, that abundance. And this idea I have also developed in one chapter on relational thinking that is coming soon as well out. And then we explore it in terms of how that concept or practice relates to close and global society, environment, and digital media. And then we go into those explorations together with our students. And then we have that journey in between that very definitional concept and this very kind of open-ended and abundant concept. So I think that's everything I wanted to say.
And that's
Yeah,
the goal.
and this is the advertisement.
And I copy edited some of that book. So I
Yes,
feel closer to the part-
Carrie's done a lot of actually reviewing.
Yeah, reading chapters.
Yeah.
Yes,
And-
exactly. Thank you,
Yeah,
Karen.
no, not much work.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
if
It was
it's
only-
not if it's not full of grammar English
It's fine.
errors
It's fine.
it's, oh yeah we're the rights.
That's quite possible, yeah.
Well, I mean, it
Just
is
plain
what
English.
it is now.
Well, thanks, Natasha, and thanks,
Yes,
thanks, I think, so that's pretty much, that's pretty much,
Yes,
show.
that's where we would wrap it up and really invite reactions and actually reflections in relation to what you think actually relational thinking is for you, what is technology, what is educational, analog, digital, etc. And are there some? And I think I did want to say in the end, can I just move the
you can stop sharing, you can stop sharing.
final
Yeah.
slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the final slide is very nice.
Oh, we have the glossary too, yeah.
Because we have the glossary.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the glossary is linked then to this notion of post-digital literacy. What is technological artifact? What is computation? What is digitation? A different approach to it. So other than just linked to the electronic world, but just really something that now we're observing it at the level of interactions, general interactions, and we can share that. And I think the previous slide,
Gotcha.
I mean, if you can just show.
The previous slide.
No, then go forward,
Yeah.
please. Thank you. And then like what is medium, what is translation in media, scaffolding. I mean, that's a very kind of old concept, but just rethinking it through semiotic scaffolding. And I think that's it. I mean, if you can just.
Sorry, yeah.
No, that's good, don't worry, guys, it's fine.
Okay.
I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it. You're just hitting it right.
The final slide literally says thank you for your insights, because we want to hear your insights.
Yeah, so thanks, Natasha. Lots of really lovely people.
Yeah.
And
Susanna has something off the top.
Can open it up.
We
for
can just
Susanna.
open it up to anyone.
and I would like,
Yeah,
Yeah,
too.
Yeah,
I would like to say that
approaching people.
forgive me, sorry. So I wanted to say quickly that we would be very grateful if the online audience, from whom only one participant is still left. Thank you, Lynn, for bearing with us. The online audience is would be grateful if they would engage with us too, if they have any comments or questions. And my good friend John, who explained that he had to leave, John Tredinik wrote from Exeter University, wrote here that it strikes me, that is John, that you have managed to create a new definition of what technological innovation is by considering semiotic agency and the way symbols grow and for whom, etc. Well, thanks, John, but he's not here anymore.
Next.
Well, and we can open up to anyone. Susanna, you had something to offer. Yeah.
Everyone.
Actually, I can see your slide with the single concept and
Yes.
in the larger spiral. Okay, glad I-
Here or further
Go
up?
further back.
Yeah.
The big one. The big one. There it is. Fantastic.
Here we
There we go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so I don't know, it's pretty odd, but when I,
Uh-huh.
listening to, looking at this and looking into your explanation. When I heard it, I sort of thought, well, what I tend to experience with my students is almost a little bit. Not quite the opposite, but let's say we're reading a complex philosophical idea, that it has a spiral and all this interweaving complexity within this. But with students who are not quite at the point of understanding the interweaving, the complexity, the multi-layered an idea, they might then, their way of connecting or relating to it is to come to
Yes,
like one small point, because that's
Yes.
where they're at.
yes,
So one student, we have our complex idea here, one student will reduce it to one small point over here, another student will have a small point too, but that'll be over
Yeah.
here. Another student, so you have all
Yes.
these different, somewhat reduced. And I say reduced in a kind nurturing way, because
Yes.
that's where they are.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
in time, they will get this complex idea. And so what I find myself sometimes doing is like, how do I validate and acknowledge this and this and this and
Yes.
this and this, because they all kind of lead to this with different interpretations and to kind of encourage the complexity. But at the same time, I don't know. At the same
You are
time-
making sense, and sorry, did you want to?
No, that was it, yeah.
Oh, okay, you are making sense, and actually what you are talking about is really relevant. It is exactly linked to this presentation. Because I'm not saying that the constraint concept is bad or negative, not at all. I just said that actually conceptual understanding or fluctuates in between to exactly what you're talking about. I hope that was clear. I'm not saying like constraint text definitions are bad or they're actually, I would actually argue that they're necessary. If that makes sense.
And we always, what makes our knowledge possible is the
actually-
limits and the constraints. So the limits that those students' limited experience, whatever
That's
the
right.
positionality influenced them in a particular way towards that concept. It's constraining, but it's also, the constraints are what embed the possible.
Exactly. So if we've actually presented to our students that these kinds of constraints are not negative, but they are part of their learning journey, then we can just embrace them on that continuum. I hope that. I think that what you said actually is perfectly aligned with it, because they would be at the different stages and they would be going in between this very, very boundary or constraint driven concept, which is fine, and this very kind of open ended. And then where you position yourself, so good is just recognizing that it fits in between the two, and that if we actually want to go more into an expanded idea of the concept, what it could be, then we're going more towards that open-endedness. If we want to actually operate with more kind of constrained, contextually constrained idea in a specific context for specific reasons, for the sake of practicality, and also what you mentioned, because there's just not enough familiarity to get, into that expanded, space, exactly. So, you will just clutch it in between the two ends, but, neither of them is negative. They're both just different ends. That's what
I'm moving this closer because this is the mic.
The students are not shy, or they're not afraid to share what they think, because then you say, well, this is just a different approach, and it's actually expected that you will not just immediately jump into this expanded, but open-ended, abundant space. You could try, but let's do that together. And I think there is a great value of learning community where actually learners share their interpretations. And that's why it's one of the reasons why we're in semiotics, because usually interpretative faculties or in students' interpretations, how actually they interpret what we are offering, or what the texts or different media offer, sometimes this is not really tapped into.
Mhm.
So it's very useful to tap into that.
So I'm wondering if, to reframe what you said, the pedagogical part of the pedagogical task, if not the pedagogical task that excellence is keeping that expansion, contraction, and expansion, contract, like life, which contract and expand.
Exactly. That's a great method.
And that's the pulse of life.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's inertia, like what had success.
Exactly, because some people try to go, we just have to go for this abundance.
And then there's not even a possibility of that. Like I see a lot of Wittgenstein there in the digitalization process, where you build the bedrock, the conventions, which if you don't, there's not the possibility of communication. Not even, not even deciphering the cultural symbol. So how can we live? How can we're not? This is very this is a problem that I have because I'm an international student, and I would miss a lot of what is being said in English. Not so much because of the language per se, but because of the cultural aspect that is embedded in the language.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you miss that. Exactly.
That's right. That was
That's
very
Renata.
nice.
Yeah,
That was
thank
very
you.
nice. Thank you. It's kind of in between trans contraction and inhale, let's say. The pulse.
Yeah, thanks Renata. I mean, we'd love to hear from anyone here, Michael, Scott. Yeah, I know Scott is a person who is a multimedia artist. So he's always dealing with different media and teaching it to students too, teaching these complexities to students. So I was wondering if this does anything for you, or if it's just a,
Yeah,
Watch out,
there's a lot of parallels. Excuse me, there's a lot of parallels with my own work. And Natasha, thank you for your presentation. And there's a lot of parallels with my teaching practice as a contemporary studio arts instructor. And one thing that crossed my mind, and there's something you said too, I wanted to come back to. It had to do with there are normative constraints that we have to acknowledge and use as a starting point. And I'm a little extreme in my views because I don't know if there are. I think that there's a random element to the way that, and even with the idea of tools and technology. Carrie and I talked about spoons once. I don't know if you know this, but I'm a spoon carver.
Yeah, you did mention that, which I didn't click fully.
Yeah.
Because I love spoons as the
We should
example.
talk about that at some point too, because even in the sense of like a technology, there's this responsiveness between the material, the embodied, the social material aspects of it, and an anthropocentric, thing that goes back into some of our discussions about affordances too. And I think that there's an arbitrary nature to it. And for example, like in teaching contemporary studio arts, one thing that crossed my mind at some point is that I was tasked with teaching foundational principles, different things. So I teach painting, I teach drawing, I teach installation, performance, and things like that. And you have a lot to choose from, historically speaking. But I think that the more interesting question for me became asking the question together with students. For example, what is tradition? And if you're in a pluralistic society like in Canada, where you're going to encounter students from a lot of different backgrounds, it got even to ask that question in terms of painting, what is traditional painting, opens up a very different situation than sitting with colleagues trying to define what you may believe in terms of just a small group of people, what the foundational aspects of painting might be. And exactly what is implied by the, you know, by the notion of tradition itself, right? So it just starts, I think it's very similar to, I don't use the same language, but it's very similar to the ideas that the three of you are exploring. I think that when, and in terms of constraints, the constraints then have like this, immediately for me, what it does is it emphasizes how this interpretive, this very Peircean interpretive, you know, kind of process is, there's a democratic element to it in how I would relate to students that that involves not so much the acknowledgement of pre-existing constraints, but understanding the relevant constraints according to the student's understanding of things, right? And then that becomes a different task as an educator to work out with the student, what is it that you're, I mean, we're talking about contemporary arts practice here, what is it that you're really looking to do, and what would be, speculatively, what would be relevant to that process. And then this is behind, Aline and Carrie and myself had a discussion a few weeks ago, and when I was talking about Arnie Ness's work in presentation, that's what I was getting at. We sort of left it off a little bit. But that dialogical aspect has, I think, it sort of spreads out from there. It becomes a much larger project than just I'm teaching a certain subject and there's a normative way that we can define the subject. And it depends on your orientation. I mean, if we're looking to understand like a particular artist, a particular theorist's work, then it can be pointed out to students, you know, and this is a constraint. It's like, look, if you really want to know what this person is talking about, that sort of intensive focused scholarship in order to just understand. But, you know, if you want to understand what your colleague here is talking about, for what's important or relative to them and how they understand these ideas, then that also requires kind of attentive focus and consciousness too, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of this. I found a lot of really interesting parallels here from looking at this. And it all has, it's very much part of very relevant to contemporary arts practice. These are things that have been worked out for, you know, at least like over a century now. You know, through even the idea of transposition of ideas from one discipline to another is very much, you know, foundational to a lot of understanding contemporary arts, understanding. So,
I think that's something we're talking about here. How do you make these transpositions, these transmediations, you know? And I want to pick up on something you said about the arts there, Scott, and bring it into what we were talking about last night, Thomas. Thomas was in my music class last night, and so are you, Ellie. And we had a conversation about constraints in the arts and how, you know, especially as musical people, so much of what you do in music is working within a constraint, play within these parameters, do this within this. And it's really how you develop your musicianship, is finding agency or freedom, responsibility within constraints, right? And something you're talking about too. I mean, Scott and Renata, you're highlighting something really complex. It's the cultural aspects of this, cultural constraints, this is very, you know, normative constraints, very, very complex stuff there. What is tradition? What is innovation? You know, like very complex. But just to get back to the question, constraints as being part of arts practice, that's worth having a conversation on, because this space, to me, this is the space we are constraining possibilities here in a productive way. Hopefully you can do something with those constraints and you can integrate them with your embodied musicianship. You can come out the other end somehow. I just wanted to hear, Scott, Thomas, do you want to add to this conversation in any way? Because I do think we're always working with constraints. It's the language we use in music. It's like it's all of our practices as music teachers. What do? We give our students constraints to work with. Essentially, that's what we do day after day.
A grammar.
I wouldn't call it a grammar as much as orienting forms and structures and movements.
Okay,
Orienting
yeah,
movements.
yeah, that's what you give to students when you teach music, because the grammar of musical theory would be too restrictive.
Yeah, yeah, like, I like, you know, it's a good question. It's a good thought. Could be grammar. That's interesting. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, anyway, I just wanted to, you know, raise that. Any thoughts here, especially our arts folks?
I don't know what to say about it, but Thomas, I'll defer to someone else who wants to comment.
You don't have to say anything either.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of interesting problems that arise with the whole conversation because it's so focused towards everything, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, I agree.
Mildly mass cultural sometimes between a family or something, so, or a person. I find teaching music very interesting because I am a particular person with a particular set of skills, and I do find myself teaching music theory, particularly to my students, and I want to, and it is very restricting, and I recognize that as at the same time wanting to be able to go other directions with students, but also that's the way I lead, and sort of dictates what the students are going to get from too, as much as I want to interpret what their needs are. We also share modern music together, so it's very much embedded in that system, that restricted system.
Correct.
And what do you find, just to ask, push on that, what do you find restrictive about the theory that you were giving your students that you feel inclined to offer your students day after day, week after week?
The 12-tone system.
Good point. That's actually inherently restrictive. And also, as stringed instrumentalists, we can get around it to some extent, and you really get around it with your fretless guitar. Or you could work against it, let's say. Yeah. That's actually really big. That's a big one, the 12-tone system. Yeah, that says it all. A whole set of theoretical foundation stems from that, right? So that's cool. That's very, it's like number theory in mathematics. It's like, oh, we're dealing with numbers here.
The issue, sorry.
No, please.
I was gonna say, I think the issue for educators though is that there's a decision at some point to say this is what the constraint is. And this is normative. And I've had this conversation even during the master's work. I remember that this is where I got into conflicts, because there'd be a painting department saying these are the disciplinary boundaries of painting. And I'd be like, says you. You know, like, yeah, it's not that that's wrong. It's one way to look at it, but I think that a lot of these constraints can be arbitrarily. This is what I find interesting as an artist, musician. This is what I find interesting. I was kind of influenced by my cousin who was able to pick up constraints in a way and say, yeah, this does this, these machines do this, guitar does a certain thing. You can transpose what you understand from a piano into a synthesizer or a drum machine. It's based on the same language, but it does something a little bit different. And what we think of as creative expression, I remember my cousin used to say to me, he's like, what you believe is creative expression is sort of how you organically interact with the constraints of this particular thing that you use, and that's all it is. And that's something you can pick up and put down. You know what I mean? And I think that kind of flexibility in thinking is for artists is like it's at the heart of creative practice. You know, where technology, you know, for a while in the 80s and 90s, it was the confusion. It was this whole thing of the confusion with industrial technological production as being technology.
Yeah, exactly.
Definition. And it's very difficult for me psychologically to get out of even thinking of the term digital technology, or even the word digital as meaning something along those lines. But I had instructors even back in the 80s who pointed out, he actually ended up, he became a teacher for a course that was supposed to be in alternative technologies. And his proposal was that we're going to do nothing but burn sticks. And that was going to be our technology. A burn stick is technology, right? So the whole, and part of that course was exploring this very idea you know, exactly what is a technology, you know, and I think that that's, you know, for me, I think that that kind of thinking, you know, transposing that type of thinking to, say, like more academic coursework really, you know, that's where I find education like a really interesting pursuit in a way. Because you start to realize that there is this element of arbitrariness to how we define these things and define what's normative. And also the degree to which we as educators or as students are able to define these things for ourselves or are obligated to fit within certain definitions of.
So that's a great point, Scott. Lots of people have seen the inadequacy with these common conceptions of technology for a long time, like your teacher, like since the 80s, like, or way before that even. We went back to the mid-19th century, and we can go back even further. But you know, yeah, these limited understandings of what technology is persist in art, in education, and you're pointing it out. It's a really good point. Just to connect the two threads, theory. So in a way, if we think about this space as divorced from embodiment, this digitization space as divorced from embodiment, it gives us a conception of theory. Like, you know, you said the language of music, the 12-tone system can be translated into a synthesizer, into a guitar, into whatever. And we can still talk about the same basic principles of music, the same system. However, you know, your conception of theory is different if you think, you know, I used to teach like RCM, harmony and counterpoint, getting the kids ready for their exams, you know, and it was all taught in this space. It's like, you all play instruments, but we're not playing instruments in this class. We're just writing on the board, giving you rules. So Bach chorales follow certain rules. If you know the formula, you can write a sufficient Bach chorale on your exam and it will follow the rules of harmony that we are establishing for you. The kids, then I asked the kids to improvise a Bach chorale, play some of this music, embody it in some way. And they can't. It's not their fault. They were not taught that way. They were simply not taught how to embody it. When I changed my approach as a theory teacher, gradually, starting from a place of embodiment and then building up towards, oh, this is where the Bach chorale comes from. Oh, this is where these harmonic sensibilities come from. You have a different sense of theory. And I think, you know, as Thomas, we teach guitar, we teach instrumental, we teach people how to play instruments. When you're teaching the theory of how to play an instrument, you're often dealing with the space of how does your hand rest on the instrument? Play this within one octave, play this within the 7th fret and the 12th fret, play this within this position. These are embodied constraints, instrumental, how your body meets the instrument. And it's theory, but it's theory that is acknowledging this analog integration more honestly, right? And you can teach only in this space. You can do pure math, you can do pure music theory, only in this space, right? That's how I would think about it. And you lose something.
Mhm. I'm thinking of one example now that you're talking about music. So the way how music is taught in schools can be very prescriptive, it can be very theory driven. And that's also my personal experience, because I went to music school and I learned how to play the guitar, and that was really theory driven, and I just used a lot of techniques, for example, visualization technique, to visualize the composition rather than really understand in an embodied way, because that was accepted. And also it was really driven by, oh, you read this piece of music and then you just interpret it. So I could interpret it, and I could kind of train myself or learn how to interpret it so well that I would go for national competitions and win first award. If you ask me, do you know how to play the guitar? My answer now would be no.
No, exactly. It's exactly the product of that kind of education, music education system I'm talking about.
I'm the example.
Yeah, you're actually the example.
But it's true.
And I had students, you know, working with Susie and in these really talented conservatory students, and they can play all kinds of things, and they're like 13 years old. But then I'd say, just improvise. Let's just play something spontaneously together, and they would freeze. They wouldn't know what to do until I was able to give them constraints. Let's play one note over and over again. That's improvising. Let's do it. Do a pulse over and over again. Maybe that one note will change eventually. Maybe it won't. Well, let's do it together. That's a constraint though. Yeah, Tanya, yeah.
I wanted to respond to what you were talking about, Scott and Natasha, about technology. And I've been interested in returning to very ancient technologies like the clam garden, the
Yeah.
fishware. So I'm a painter. So I'm approaching this not from a musical lens, but from a visual arts lens and body practice lens. So I've been collecting pieces of scrap plywood that wash up on beaches. So, and experimenting with them as a surface to paint on as an oil painter. I discovered that plywood is an ancient Egyptian technology. It's very old and we take it for granted. It's just like this thing that we build our houses with, we make platforms with, we kind of scaffold and then we take it down and throw it out to form cement. But it's this very, very old technology that Egyptians discovered because they didn't have access to trees. So they found that by cutting wood into very thin plies and then adhering it with adhesive, it created this much stronger material than a solid piece of wood. And so returning to this, using this ancient technology that I haven't bought, it's not digital, but it is actually teaching me things that I couldn't learn using new technology. So it's creating new knowledge. It's speaking to me from the past and the future. It's like it's bringing forward an awareness that technology is non-linear. It's circular, and I have nothing definitive to say about it, but I just feel like there's very much of an emphasis on a linear understanding of technological development, and my new relationship with this ancient technology has given me a different appreciation for that circular nature of that reflexive relationship between creating art and technology. It's not just always going forward into the future, into the digital realm. There is a lot coming that goes back to things that we take for granted. We take it very much for granted. Yeah.
That's such a great point.
Absolutely.
There's a lot to think about, honestly. But I think that's exactly the idea. Yeah, it's moving forwards and backwards in time. It's not just going forward. There's path dependency. We retrace
Exactly.
those steps and we move backwards. Oh, this led to this, but we can also lead backwards, right? And I think that's such a important point. Never just forward.
No, it's not. I just have one other thing to add to that because I'm very excited about this ancient knowledge that we have. A lot of it we have actually lost. So we have this idea that modernity, we're just continuously moving forward and improving on our knowledge. So one of my favorite colors to paint with is this color called Prussian blue, which was invented or discovered in the 18th century in Berlin by a paint maker. He was trying to create something that would get as close to Egyptian blue as possible, which we've lost the formula for Egyptian blue, which is the most light fast color known to humans. It retains this intensity better than any other color. We don't know the formula for it anymore. We've lost it. And so this was this guy's attempt to kind of get it as close to this ancient technology, which we no longer have access to as he could. Which just reminds me as a painter that we're not always going forward. We are actually struggling to remember what's been lost or what we knew before. So I wonder if this digital literacy I would love to have a conversation as I learn more about it enabling us to actually return and reintegrate some of this lost knowledge.
I think that's why I started with clam gardens and the fish weir. It's like,
Yeah.
well, it takes a while to see that.
Yes.
Oh, I'm standing on this beach and there's these rock walls and I'm not really sure what's around me, and I have some sense, and eventually it clicks. Oh, this is technology.
Right.
This is, yeah, anyway, I can go on.
Well, I was just gonna add quickly, just to link what
Yeah.
you're bringing up, Tanya, with what you folks have been talking about with respect to embodiment. Is that part of the challenge? Is that how do you not just have a formula for Egyptian blue, but the embodied making of it that it then becomes what it was.
Right.
And so how do we do that when we've lost the first step, I guess, the recipe, as it were?
Yeah.
But I think of that in terms of, craft traditions, that it's so much more than, follow the YouTube on how to use a scroll saw in carpentry. It's sitting with someone who can help you with this thing. You get to the subtleties of music's another good example that the others of you can speak to.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this connects, but I was just finding this conversation around constraints really interesting, and it really made me think a lot about the ethical ramifications. So if we have restraints, I love your examples, like one tone or the burn sticks, or what I might give to my students, crazy 2 colors. And so within that, you start to notice all kinds of subtleties that would be lost otherwise if you had all this other stuff without, not within those constraints. So you have this very small amount of stuff or whatever that you're giving your attention to, but the way in which you're giving your attention starts to change than if you have so many different things that are within the realm of your possibility, that you start to notice subtleties. You start to notice how materials behave. Like, this is a big thing for me, with an art practice. You start to really notice how materials behave and the ethos with materials, and to me, it has many ramifications of how we pay attention to the world. And speaking of lost art, it's like to pay attention to really subtle things and to give it our full attention when there's, all these other technologies. I know I'm supposed to use that word, but I'm just wondering how that connects.
Yeah.
Because it actually changes our ability to pay attention to the world itself, which has huge equity.
Yes, this is so interesting. I think it also aligns with the idea of dromology, and that's basically it's Paul Birliev's idea on the acceleration of technological kind of digital technology, visual technology development, which basically says that these developments are happening at such a speed that it doesn't allow us to pause and reflect and take this deeper insight, especially when it comes to, like, let's compare what's going on in classrooms and what we see, on the internet, what kind of, those kind of modern digital in terms of electric and visual media developments, like how everything is so accelerated. And then we also talk about things like, accelerated academia. That there's so much pressure coming from all sorts of sides, to perform, to kind of publish in, fast and a lot of publications, etc. And then we have the counter movement, which is all the kind of the slow movements. I'm sure you have heard kind of, it goes from slow thinking to slow food, slow fashion. Yes, I don't know if there's slow music.
They pioneered it.
Exactly. Kind of, maybe slow art. Do you want? Maybe that's what you're talking about. Maybe that's a kind of. We need to slow down.
And this conception of technology, like you're saying, Natasha, is a great point. It's speeding us up. We have to somehow resist that. And I think to build on John's point, who was online there, maybe we have some new way of reworking common understandings of technological progress, technological innovation, I think is the term. And we have a sense of moving forward, accelerating innovation, etc. But we can think of technology from the place of analog reintegration or integration, and it looks different. It looks like the spoon, I think, as Scott said. And we often think as like a spoon, I heard this from originally an indigenous mentor who was talking about possible pan-indigenous conceptions of technological. So he was just very early kind of speculative conversation, but he brought up the spoon as an example, and even Umberto Eco brought up the spoon as an example. So it's interestingly that they both kind of got to there. And the idea is that there's no spoon 2.0. There's no one's gonna make a better tomorrow, and everyone in the world is gonna throw out their spoon. Oh, finally, we can replace this with the new spoons we've been waiting for. No, the spoon is a perfect example of technological innovation and progress. It does what it needs to do very well. It integrates with our body. It has a shape, exactly. It follows our natural embodiment. We can contain things in our hands, right? So there's no spoon 2.0, but yet there's always technology 2.0. There's always something ahead of you. There's always the next chat, whatever.
That's sort of understanding because I think it is about slowing down, it is about engaging in depth with materials and then we start noticing. And then it's about noticing as well as reflecting at maybe more theoretical level. I mean, it's always both theoretical and, you know, to some extent, even some kind of minimal extent, from whatever kind of positionality we're coming from. But I think it's just slowing down and engage with what we're dealing with is something that we need to reconnect with probably like again and more. And I think that's what you were talking about in terms of like really noticing those nuances and getting in depth with particular things that you know we can frame them as constraints, but actually there is value, there is merit to actually get in depth with these.
I mean, I think that's important. Our definition of constraint has no negative connotation.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah,
Constraint
absolutely.
is how you have affordances.
Exactly.
Like my hand being constrained this way is how I have this, right? It's how I have digits.
Yeah.
I can do things with. I evolved this way. We evolved this way, right? Yeah, please, Michael.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, you're not. I'm not saying anything else.
But others have been alluding to this, and I'm gonna try to put language to it that may or may not be apt, but there are socio-political constraints that then are different than the kind of constraints you're talking about. So
Yeah.
Speech of origin.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like,
So,
yeah.
well, I'll give you an example.
Management systems.
Yeah,
Efficiency or
exactly.
management systems.
Exactly.
I was talking with a grad student last night in my ed practice masters, and he's the only one in the class who is teaching a trade. He's a metal worker and he teaches metalwork. And I said, well, this is really interesting. How long are your class periods? And he said, oh, well, they were, this is sort of an aside joke here. They were 90 minutes, they're now 89. So the very fact that they lost a minute has to do with all sorts of ridiculous, again, sociopolitical structuring of the full day and over the term. But it was interesting also that his was the only class in our class that had that kind of protracted amount of time. Everybody else was operating on, 40-minute periods and things like that. And there's a constraint that is that different than the kind of constraints that you're talking about. And so this.
I think it's a subcase.
Sorry?
I would say it's a subcase.
A subcase?
I would say.
Yeah, in the sense of, how is it like in terms of kinds of constraints?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
I would think about the balance that are attached to the constraint because there is a certain value and then it becomes
Yeah.
political, it becomes ideological.
Yeah.
And then we can talk about what you mentioned, kind of constraints then become political. And then we have, the constraints that are, then we can say that, they can be negative if they have some sort of negative ideological value-based effect or impact.
And if it short circuits that process that you folks are talking about, I mean, that's what I find really.
Yeah, exactly.
Compelling is to rethink.
So,
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, it depends too on the way that you conceive, your own aims and how you use a certain technology, for example. Right? So if you have like here's an example of paintings I'm making now. I've done them by hand. I use a lot of kinds of mechanical production, like screen printing. And then I figured out a way where it's too expensive for me to make them screen printed. So I figured out a way to do them with digital kind of assistance with projectors, but it's not, they look like they're screen printed, but they're made by hand. And all of my friends have looked at them and said, well, why don't you just screen print? It's a lot more efficient, it's faster. I'm like, it's not the point. I'm like, the point of my use of these technologies, I'm not working for the Ford plant in 1920. I'm not manufacturing cars, I'm making art. So this is just not but it's strange how that whole idea of efficiency, even in terms of education. I teach online courses and I'm absolutely convinced the main purpose, the main aims of this hasn't, there are some elements that I think are positive about it. But the management and control system aspect of that, I think, is one of the big reasons why it's used, maybe one of the main reasons it's used. That fits in with certain economic models, and being able to manage larger groups of people.
Yeah.
And that my teaching, increasingly is becoming responsive to the requirements of that system rather than the other way around, which implies value systems and all sorts of things.
Absolutely. I mean, there was an article that actually looked, because there's always this hype about innovative technologies. Let's use them in education. I mean, that's the rhetoric. And then the article is Henderson, Selvin, they asked students how they actually use technology. Right. And I think they collected data from more than 1,000 students at an Australian university or universities. And then, the outcomes were, I think, quite disappointing. Because you would then expect, okay, we're using it quite creatively. Maybe we're creating this, creating that, discussing, I think, no, majority of students actually use it for highly kind of managerial purposes. And also that was the use of technology. Okay, let's manage time or let's organize time. Let's organize myself, like kind of watching, because watching is more kind of passive acquisition. I mean, it can be active engagement of the senses, but it wasn't, the point was that technology that was used was very limited, and then the ways how it was, how the technology was used was very limiting.
It's very personal. It's like there's the idea of definition, and then the idea of the definition being how things, what is associated, everything associated with something. The way that it's used.
The regulative ideal equal. But Michael, you were going to finish your example about the steel workers, right? Did you?
I was a question
Okay.
for you about your comment. Actually, I have 2 things to that. What you said about why don't you do this faster? Or I was wondering if now that we have this broader concept of technology, if that the difference between art and automation might be loss of vitality, because we're interacting with it's organic and organic. So there's vital energy, if you will. But when there's automation, there's a sort of death.
I don't know. It's just all, the way I talk about technology with students is that it just does something different. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's what values the ethos of how you interact with technology and just just processes in general. They just do different things. I had, my father-in-law, he's really anti-electronic music. They make electronic music, so he lectures me. I saw him in the summer, and my wife saw me talking to him. She's like, "What was my dad talking about?" And I'm like, "Well, I got another lecture where he tried to pin me down on like how electronic drums, they're just mechanical and blah blah blah." Like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. So, but it's the same, sort of idea of like that he says there's no vitality. It could be if it's used in a certain way. But the way I look at it, playing, regular instruments or having a background in that and using a lot of electronic instruments, I'm like, they just do different things. Screen printing does a different thing. And I have arguments with studio mates about this, where for a painter, I don't understand. A professional painter has a lot of international exhibitions, and claims he can't see the difference between me making dot matrix patterns by hand and a screen print. It's absolutely obvious to me. Why? It's like with you, Suzanne, it's like you're looking at it and become increasingly sensitized to it. You're like, no, there is a difference. It's not my imagination. It's being done a different way. And so, even to say that because, my friend was saying, well, now you're making these paintings by hand. And I'm like, I'm using a digital projector, dude. It's just a different, and it results in something slightly different.
Yeah, the
It's-
Umbel two is
it's like
different
this.
than the Umbel one, right? It's
Yeah.
it's different, it's changed, it's
And
extended.
because you have a
It
different
could be exactly that
Different path.
There are
situation.
different, because you talked about different kinds and different degrees. So that's where I'm coming.
But if I may, I have.
Wait, hold on, I just wanna say one thing, yeah, so just to acknowledge that we're over time now, and Thomas, you have to leave, have a good gig, have a good gig.
Cheers.
Thanks, Thomas. for
Going to something much more entertaining.
And I just wanna say, yeah, no, just thank you, so I know we've made it through a long time together.
Thank you, yeah, thanks so
And-
much to
and,
everyone.
And I want to say just also if Cristiano or Anna Maria or Nicole or Marion want to say anything at all, the science educators, the other people who work with technology in various ways. Is there anything that you want to offer, or you don't have to?
Yeah, actually, I was just thinking about this very interesting diagram, and going back and forth between those more constrained definitions and those more encompassing ones. And I was kind of struck by your comment about teaching music sometimes can be so, normative, because generally science is regarded as this in this place, and so I didn't thought about this, but also I was thinking about the role of diversity in this spiral, building on what Susanna said about everyone has their own definitions, and how diversity is very important to this, not only the community, but also a diverse community, with different points of view. And also another comment that it's another thing about symbols being technology as well. And it made me remember of an example in the history of chemistry, because actually in the 19th centuries, 18th century actually, the organic chemists, they used long phrases, long sentences to describe the experiment. And then
Until Brazilian formulas.
yes, they came up with the formulas.
Oh, that's why you know it.
This was game changing because they could think differently about the reactions itself, and so and
It's a technology.
It's technology,
It has changed this, yeah.
Definitely, and so there's a book about this actually, and so I think that it corroborates what you said, about this. So those were the 2 points.
That's super interesting.
May I comment something on this, because I'm burning to say two things actually, but I'll keep it to one. Gary is not looking at this.
Pacing, I've seen it pacing.
Yes, oh, yeah.
No, I'm just keeping track of everyone. I can't stop pacing.
Because from the perspective that we're trying to develop here, that's where we see what's the vantage point. That's right. There's something we're building on. Like I think this was something very interesting in this example that Scott gave earlier, right? When someone was telling him, looks at his painting and he says, why don't you use this other technology instead? From our point of view, that person, the technological artifact is not the raw material that comes to constitute, so to say, that frame, that painting, right? But
It
what?
can be, but it's not entirely.
But
It's part of
it's the contingency of a semiotic agent in that, is it right? It's interpreted. When I'm saying painting, I'm already interpreting it, right?
When you hear sound.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, you're
Yeah,
right.
and the thing is that you and the guy asking, you might be looking at the same stuff, but you're analogically integrating it differently, and actually you're him and you, or her and you, are actually working there with different technological artifacts, right? Again, the technological artifact is not that splash of color out there, but to put it all too easily, an interpreter semiotic work with it, right? And
The mind out.
the mind's out working, yeah. And is what I'm saying here making sense? Because I would say, I'm saying I understand so well what you're saying, and what we're looking at over there is people making different technological artifacts out of that. Same way with how say some European colonists did not see the indigenous technology. They thought it was pristine nature, so to say, right?
To put it simply, you interpret it and then how you use it, it actually shows how you have interpreted it.
Yeah,
And then you
leads to
can,
different directions.
exactly,
And that's the path.
spatial, temporal.
It's happening in many different spatial. This is why we call this a spatial analog.
A philosophy of science kind of thing too. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
like-
Yeah.
Because it's, I guess in art, the way we look at it is that there's an artifact, artifact,
Mhm.
art object. And, you know, if we have no information about the culture, it just, I don't know, it's like a very T.S. Kuhn kind of thing. It's like we're interpreting it according to what we know, we're interpreting it according to our culture,
100%.
all that kind of stuff, but
Absolutely.
that may have absolutely nothing to do with why, what it is, how it was made.
So your father. Starting from different.
But the interesting thing in art is that there is this thing that's kind of inert in a sense. It's just kind of there emanating potential, you know, interpretations according to whoever is looking at it, which is, I guess, gets back to some aspects of philosophy of science about
Absolutely.
what the nature of,
Yes.
of the world around us is and
Definitely.
how we interpret it.
That's why I made.
That's why I was throwing the hot potato and
Sorry.
throwing.
We knew. Science, we
Yeah.
just knew it.
Oh, it
Yeah.
actually it's okay. I mean, for me, it's been really nourishing just hearing from everyone else.
Yeah.
But just if I can offer a sort of an overarching comment on it all, I just find it really quite thrilling and exciting that what the three of you are proposing really is a different way of thinking about learning, and therefore a different way of thinking about teaching.
Yeah.
And so it'll be really, I was gonna say cool to see this in written form at some point that we can engage in the concepts in more sustained ways, I guess.
It's happening.
That's the
That's what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's what you're
Yes.
working towards.
Thank you.
And the book, right, there will be a piece of that coming out. The other thing I guess I just want to say, to speak to that is that, I really admire the more subtle way of thinking about technology and technologies and digitization, because I think, again, the easy binary of the analog and the digital has been too.
It's too easy.
Yeah, it's too easy. And then I think that the most apt description of it for me is that just that simplistic notion of it's the on-off switch. That's technology. And then to think of it in these subtler ways that really are ultimately far more internal is really important, and also are more subtle when they're worked in the landscape, as some of the examples you gave. And so that's, I think, really helpful, those two senses, right, of being careful of the binaries and that fundamental, the digital to the analog, which are still useful concepts, but you have it as part of a dynamic now, not as this is analog, this is.
Yeah. He says, "Hey." You can say. And which is a.
And I guess that's the other thing, and it's just coming back to this, the sociopolitics of constraints. And I think that'd be an interesting thing to write a bit more about and to talk, for us all to talk a bit more about, because I really appreciate the positive in the sense of what allows, enables affordances that you're thinking, that you're talking about constraints. But this whole sociopolitical element is really troubling to me, because what we're seeing often, I think, because I'm the old guy here, I get to say, you know, when I was a boy, what's it looked like was, is an ever decreasing capacity to provide platforms and spaces for affordances. Seems to be more constraints. political kind. And going back to my teacher who now has 89 minutes as opposed to 90 minutes for no shop class. We got talking about that, and then the constraints that are additionally around that, because now there are these, again, socio-political things that he has to insert into the class that constrain that 89 minutes even. So, you know, they have to do with his surveillance and administration of the students, et cetera, that are, you know, often talked about under the umbrella of health and safety things, but in fact are asking him to limit the amount of available time to explore and to learn and to be part of something together.
I think your question you asked, Michael, are these kinds of, or are they? No, that's a good question. It's a good question.
I'd love to hear.
I mean,
They could be of a somewhat different nature.
I wouldn't say different nature. I don't think.
We're not supposed to use the nature. Yeah.
No. I would say in the sense that they're not of different kind.
Yeah.
But no, I would certainly say, I mean, if this gives any insight here, I would certainly think of, say, grammar rules as constraints. I would certainly think of cultural norms as constraints.
Which I think are different kind of constraints than the ones I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
And I just think of what sociopolitical constraints often do, and others of you can speak to this better than I can. It compels people to undermine, but not necessarily be able to thrive.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
That actually is of a different kind.
I think so.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying.
It is of a different kind, but then you can actually explain what it is. And I think it goes back to what we said earlier about actually understanding the value, but also when we look at the constraint, what happens afterwards? Like,
Exactly.
what happens after the constraint?
Right.
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah.
So, you know, what is the impact? What are the outcomes of having had that constraint? So if you can see some sort of really negative, as you say, socio-political effect, then you can understand the kind of the constraint. And I think this is a very, very important discussion. Like that has to be.
Actually, just a slight aside here. This is sort of old guy talking. This is how Kerry and I met. When what actually drew us together was a reference to Umberto Eco's The Open Work.
Yeah, you're right.
Back in a grad course, right?
I was thinking with you, yeah.
We started talking about that in light of, you know, the larger sociological conceptions, again, along a continuum of closed societies vis-a-vis open societies, so Popper's notion. And that gets really interesting there because, you know, as any of you who lived in sociologically defined closed societies, you may well have found many ways to thrive in the face of those things. But one wonders in relation to what the other possibilities could have been. So I don't know, as you said, Natasha, just now, that's a conversation, I guess, for us to have, and especially thinking about in educational settings and what that looks like now.
Yeah.
You would know that so well, actually, both of you in Britain, what's happened in the school system as well as in the university system. It's just a total undermining of what those foundational education systems, at least in the Western tradition, have been seen, right? That the greater what do you call it? What are those periodic assessment procedures they do in Britain? Yes, REF, is that
research excellence framework?
Yeah, the research, isn't that lovely?
Yeah,
and you know, as those lovely euphemisms that are used in the research excellence framework. I mean, what could be wrong with that? To seek excellence, research and have a framework.
This framework.
Exactly. Yes, don't you? And you know, a friend who came through that at Cambridge said it was absolutely in both infuriating and also like a real effect on one's mental health.
Yeah.
I've seen firsthand the horrible effects on that. At the same time, Natasha and I were talking around.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for showing up for this whole time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
We'll hear from you later. What you think? Yeah. Okay. So, hope be careful. Thank you, Anna.
Bye.
and yet, as Natasha and I were talking the other day, there's
Yeah, I'm sure. Thanks for being here, Michael. I really appreciate
not
it.
any constraint. I also have been in academic environments like that, and not having any.
I appreciate you.
Sheer corruption.
Context of German populations.
Actually, yes, I had even had in mind some other countries where I worked, but Germany comes close to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Not to say that ref is good, no.
yeah,
Having no constraint at all.
It's
Yeah,
another,
yeah.
yeah. Just thinking, continue.
Just observing everything on that.
Yeah,
Continue.
Going back to
Exactly.
Because of course, then the constraints are of that kind that you were talking about are really socio-political when they're not technical, right?
Yeah.
When there's not a technical form of assessment, they you have something to fight against, but you can't win over
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Great. Sorry, I was just checking the time here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, wonderful. Well, I think we made it to the end. So I appreciate
We made it
everyone's
beyond the end.
conversation. We made it beyond.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And
Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks for staying this long too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for the
And
presentation.
yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully we'll have also opportunities to talk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm here for one more week. Natasha is here for a bit longer.
Yeah, 2 more weeks. so.
Nice. Yeah, so maybe we can work. with
We'll do something, yeah.
Figure together.
I was also burning to say something on path dependencies, but I'm looking for the next opportunity.
I'm right back. I just want to pee and I'll be.
Yeah,
back in-
Okay.
Good.
Been holding it.
Yeah.
Maybe we can just stretch.
Yeah,
What did you want to say about path dependencies?
Embodied ending.
I think that you made a super important point earlier, which I do not fully. I wish right now, which I don't have that fresh in my mind anymore, but there was something very important over there. Because yeah, just kind of trying to briefly remember, because for us both path dependencies and something like backwards causation are very important. The way we talk about path dependencies in terms of semiotic scaffolding.
Right.
And exactly in the way that you were explaining, we actually oppose in that regard to the type of transhumanism like Steve Fuller that endorse logical freedom, right? That path dependencies do not constrain our future evolution and development. And I think yes, they do. One of the most important kind of concepts that I think that underpins our thinking comes from these tables where I was mentioned before. It says something I almost remember this quote by heart. He says that educational theory overlooks the important truth. He says that what makes learning possible is also what is the same that limits it, right? And this is one way of saying that learning is interpretative, right? And yeah, and there's also, I think, hand in hand with our theory, a very important part and parcel of our theory that we did not discuss, only Natasha mentioned it in passing, for example, is imagination, because learning is about producing the future. Learning is about producing new. Question to ask is, how do we select stuff to digitize? I think the imagination, the future that we produce could be explained through backwards causation, and when I'm still trying to figure this out. Also, I think Michael touched upon this a bit earlier, but yeah, I think there's a very important something very important to ponder on here is how both the past, our histories, right, our path dependencies, and our future, that is our projections about the future, the present futures, right, the present media futures, how do both of these simultaneously shape, constrain, thwart our current behavior, and which is where learning happens, right? But you can see I can go into I can get really distracted here, you know, in many new pathways, right? But I find that the point that you made earlier is I think it's super important.
I'd love to continue the conversation about that backwards causation at some point. I think it's a really interesting and just it's deep and fast. We could probably talk a long time about it.
Thank you.
I'm pondering it too. I don't really understand it, but interacting with it is really fascinating. I don't think it's really celebrated in the classrooms today
Yes.
or in our conversations about technology.